Khrushchev had set a trap, and Eisenhower walked right into it. When the Soviets shot down the U-2, they did not announce it immediately. They waited. They wanted to see what America would say. And America lied. NASA issued a statement. A weather research aircraft has gone missing over Turkey, they said. The pilot probably passed out from oxygen loss. The plane may have drifted into Soviet airspace. Khrushchev smiled. Now he would play his second card. The next day, he appeared before the world press. "We did not just shoot down the plane," he said. "We also captured the pilot, and he has confessed everything." He showed the evidence, the cameras, the film, the spy equipment, and Powers himself. Eisenhower's lie was exposed before the entire world. A president had been caught lying to the public. This loss of trust would last for years. This is the story of the greatest intelligence disaster in American history, and how a Soviet leader outmaneuvered the most powerful man on Earth. The U-2 was unlike any aircraft ever built. The pilots called it the Dragon Lady. Beautiful, but deadly. Difficult to fly, unforgiving of mistakes. Lockheed's legendary engineer Kelly Johnson designed it in just 80 days. The CIA wanted an aircraft that could fly higher than any Soviet fighter or missile could reach. Johnson delivered exactly that. The U-2 cruised at 70,000 feet, 21 kilometers high. At that altitude, the sky turns black. The curvature of the Earth becomes visible. The air is so thin that water boils at body temperature. No Soviet aircraft could reach that height. The MiG-19s and MiG-21s topped out at 60,000 feet. The U-2 flew serenely above them, photographing everything below. The cameras were equally remarkable. They could photograph a newspaper headline from 70,000 feet. Every Soviet military installation, every nuclear facility, every troop movement was captured in extraordinary detail. Starting in 1956, U-2s flew regular missions over the Soviet Union. The Soviets knew they were there. Their radars tracked every flight. But they could do nothing. Their fighters could not climb high enough. Their missiles fell short. It was humiliating. The Americans were violating Soviet airspace with impunity, photographing the nation's most sensitive secrets. And the mighty Soviet military was powerless to stop them. But the Soviets were working on the problem. A new surface-to-air missile called the SA-2 was in development. Each version flew higher than the last. By 1960, they believed it could finally reach the Dragon Lady. They were waiting for the right moment. Francis Gary Powers was not a military officer. He was a civilian contractor working for the CIA. The distinction mattered. If captured, the United States could claim he was not on a military mission. Powers had joined the U-2 program in 1956. He was an experienced pilot, skilled at handling the temperamental aircraft. He had flown numerous missions along the Soviet border, though never directly over Soviet territory. May Day 1960 would be different. Powers was assigned to fly the most ambitious U-2 mission ever attempted. He would take off from Peshawar, Pakistan, fly across the entire Soviet Union, and land in Bodo, Norway. Nearly 4,000 miles over enemy territory. The route would take him over some of the most sensitive sites in the Soviet Union. The Baikonur Cosmodrome, where Soviet rockets launched. The nuclear testing grounds at Semipalatinsk. The plutonium production facilities at Chelyabinsk. Powers was briefed on what to do if something went wrong. The aircraft was equipped with a self-destruct mechanism. A switch in the cockpit would trigger explosives, destroying the cameras and sensitive equipment. He was also given a silver dollar containing a poison needle. If captured, he could end his own life rather than face interrogation. The CIA assured him that neither precaution would be necessary. The U-2 was invulnerable. No Soviet weapon could touch it. They were wrong. If you want to discover the secret technologies and untold stories of the Cold War, subscribe to our channel. We bring you new content every week. May 1st, 1960. Powers lifted off from Peshawar at 6:20 in the morning local time. The weather was perfect. clear skies across the Soviet Union, ideal conditions for photography. Powers climbed to 70,000 feet and crossed into Soviet airspace near the Afghan border. Soviet radar detected him immediately. Tracking stations across Central Asia followed his progress. Interceptor aircraft scrambled, but they could not reach his altitude. The U-2 continued serenely northward. At 8:53 Moscow time, Powers was approaching Sverdlovsk, a major industrial city in the Ural Mountains. Below him lay one of the Soviet Union's most important military-industrial complexes. A battery of SA-2 missiles was waiting. The first missile launched at approximately 900 hours. It climbed through the atmosphere, its guidance system locked onto the high-flying target. Powers never saw it coming. The missile detonated near the aircraft's tail. Shrapnel tore through the fragile fuselage. The U-2 began to break apart. Powers was thrown violently as the aircraft tumbled out of control. He struggled to reach the self-destruct switch, but could not. The centrifugal forces pinned him to his seat. He managed to release his canopy and was sucked out of the cockpit. He fell for nearly 15 kilometers before opening his parachute at a safe altitude. Soviet farmers watched him drift down into a field near the village of Degtyarsk. Within minutes, he was surrounded. The invulnerable aircraft had been shot down. The pilot was alive, and the CIA's greatest secret was now in Soviet hands. The CIA had a cover story prepared. If a U-2 was ever lost over the Soviet Union, they would claim it was a weather research aircraft that had accidentally strayed off course. On May 3rd, NASA issued a press release. A U-2 aircraft conducting atmospheric research over Turkey had gone missing. The pilot had reported difficulties with his oxygen system. He may have lost consciousness, and the aircraft drifted into Soviet territory. The statement included technical details about the NASA weather research program. It named the pilot as a NASA employee, not a CIA contractor. It expressed hope that the Soviets would assist in locating the missing aircraft and pilot. The story was immediately picked up by news agencies around the world. American newspapers reported the unfortunate accident. Editorials speculated about whether the Soviets would return the pilot. Behind the scenes, CIA officials were confident. Even if the Soviets had recovered wreckage, the sensitive equipment should have been destroyed by the self-destruct mechanism. And Powers had been given clear instructions to use the poison needle rather than be captured alive. They assumed he was dead. They assumed the evidence was destroyed. They assumed their cover story would hold. All three assumptions were wrong. Nikita Khrushchev was a master of political theater. He understood that timing and presentation were everything. When his military commanders reported that they had shot down an American spy plane and captured its pilot alive, Khrushchev saw an opportunity. He would not simply expose the American lie. He would let America dig itself deeper first. On May 5th, Khrushchev addressed the Supreme Soviet. He announced that an American aircraft had violated Soviet airspace and been shot down. He showed pieces of the wreckage. He condemned the American aggression. But he said nothing about the pilot. The American government responded exactly as Khrushchev hoped. The State Department doubled down on the NASA cover story. The aircraft was conducting weather research. It had accidentally strayed over the border. There was no espionage involved. Secretary of State Christian Herter stated publicly that there had been no deliberate attempt to violate Soviet airspace. The flights, he assured the press, were purely scientific. Khrushchev waited one more day. Then he sprung the trap. On May 7th, he returned to the Supreme Soviet. He was practically gleeful. "Yesterday, I deliberately did not say that the pilot was alive and well," he announced. "And now, look at what the Americans have said." He held up the evidence. Photographs of Powers in Soviet custody. The pilot's survival kit. His cameras. His film, filled with images of Soviet military installations. And most damning, Powers' own signed confession admitting he was on a CIA spy mission. The world gasped. The American government had been caught in a blatant lie. Not just a small deception, but a complete fabrication presented as official government statement. President Dwight Eisenhower faced an impossible situation. For 4 years, U-2 flights over the Soviet Union had been America's most closely guarded secret. Eisenhower had personally approved each mission. He knew exactly what the aircraft were doing. And now, his government had been caught lying about it. He had 2 choices. He could claim ignorance, say that the CIA had conducted the flights without his knowledge. This would protect him personally, but would suggest that rogue elements were running American foreign policy. Or he could admit the truth. Yes, the United States had been spying on the Soviet Union. Yes, he had known about it. Yes, the government had lied. Eisenhower chose honesty. It was perhaps the only moment in history when an American president publicly admitted to espionage. On May 11th, he acknowledged that the U-2 flights had been conducted with his knowledge and approval. He defended them as necessary for national security. He refused to apologize. But the damage was done. Eisenhower, the former Supreme Allied commander who had defeated Nazi Germany, was now seen as a liar on the world stage. His reputation for integrity, carefully built over decades, was tarnished. Khrushchev was not finished. He demanded an apology. He demanded punishment for those responsible. He demanded that Eisenhower personally guarantee that such flights would never happen again. Eisenhower refused all 3 demands. He suspended the U-2 flights, but would not apologize or punish anyone. The confrontation was heading toward a crisis. The timing could not have been worse. A summit conference was scheduled to begin in Paris on May 16th. Eisenhower, Khrushchev, British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, and French President Charles de Gaulle would meet to discuss reducing Cold War tensions. Arms control, Berlin, nuclear testing, everything was on the table. For years, diplomats had worked toward this moment. The hope was that the 4 leaders could find common ground and begin to thaw the frozen relationship between East and West. The U-2 incident destroyed those hopes before the summit even began. Khrushchev arrived in Paris, still demanding an apology. Eisenhower arrived unwilling to give one. The other leaders watched helplessly as the 2 superpowers collided. On the summit's opening day, Khrushchev launched into a furious tirade. He denounced American aggression. He called Eisenhower a hypocrite. He declared that no meaningful negotiations were possible while the United States refused to apologize and punish those responsible. Then he delivered his ultimatum. Unless Eisenhower met his demands, the Soviet Union would withdraw from the summit. Eisenhower sat stone-faced. He had commanded the largest military operation in history. He had faced down Hitler. He would not be bullied by Khrushchev. The summit collapsed without a single substantive session. The leaders went home. The opportunity for détente vanished, and the Cold War, which had seemed to be thawing, froze solid once again. Gary Powers was put on trial in Moscow in August 1960. It was a show trial, designed for propaganda value rather than justice. The Soviet court was packed with journalists from around the world. Powers sat in the defendant's box, facing charges of espionage. The maximum penalty was death. Powers cooperated with his captors. He admitted that he was on a spy mission. He described the U-2 program in detail. He apologized to the Soviet people for violating their airspace. Some Americans were horrified. They expected Powers to resist, to refuse to cooperate, to die rather than betray his country. Instead, he seemed to be helping the Soviets score propaganda points. The court found Powers guilty and sentenced him to 10 years in prison. 3 years in a labor camp, followed by 7 years in a penitentiary. Back in America, debate raged about Powers' conduct. Should he have used the poison needle? Should he have activated the self-destruct mechanism? Should he have resisted interrogation? CIA officials defended him publicly while questioning him privately. Powers maintained that he had done his best under impossible circumstances. The self-destruct mechanism had failed, Using the poison needle would have served no purpose since the Soviets already had the aircraft and its equipment. Powers would spend 21 months in Soviet custody before his fate changed again. On February 10, 1962, a prisoner exchange took place on the Glienicke Bridge connecting West Berlin to East Germany. On one side stood Gary Powers, on the other, Rudolf Abel, a Soviet spy who had been captured in New York in 1957. Abel was one of the most important Soviet agents ever caught in the United States. The two men walked toward each other across the bridge. Halfway across, they passed without speaking. Powers continued to the west, Abel continued to the east. Powers was finally free, but he returned to an America that did not quite know what to make of him. He was debriefed extensively by the CIA. Investigators concluded that he had not revealed any information beyond what the Soviets could have learned from the captured aircraft. He was cleared of any wrongdoing. But the public suspicion lingered. Powers was not treated as a hero. He was not given a parade. He lived quietly, working as a test pilot and eventually as a helicopter pilot for a Los Angeles television station. In 1977, Powers died when his helicopter crashed while covering brush fires. He was 47 years old. In 2000, 40 years after the incident, the United States Air Force posthumously awarded Powers the Prisoner of War Medal, the Distinguished Flying Cross, and the National Defense Service Medal. It was a belated recognition that he had done his duty under impossible circumstances. The U-2 incident had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate diplomatic crisis. The Paris summit collapse ended any hope of early détente with the Soviet Union. The Cold War hardened. Military spending on both sides increased. The arms race accelerated. The incident contributed to the climate of tension that would produce the Cuban Missile Crisis 2 years later. Without the U-2 affair, Khrushchev might have been less aggressive in placing missiles in Cuba. The world might never have come so close to nuclear war. For the United States, the lesson was painful but clear. Overhead reconnaissance was too valuable to abandon, but too risky to conduct with manned aircraft. The solution was satellites. Within months of the U-2 incident, the first successful Corona reconnaissance satellite was launched. Satellites could photograph Soviet territory without the risk of another shootdown. The CIA's reputation suffered. The agency had assured Eisenhower that the U-2 was invulnerable. It was not. They had assured him that even if shot down, the pilot would die and the evidence would be destroyed. Neither happened. The overconfidence that had led to the disaster would lead to other failures in the years ahead. For Khrushchev, the incident was a short-term triumph, but a long-term problem. He had humiliated Eisenhower, but he had also convinced many Americans that the Soviet Union could not be trusted. The hardliners in Washington grew stronger. The path to peaceful coexistence grew longer. The U-2 incident demonstrated that in the Cold War, a single mistake could have global consequences. One flight, one missile, one captured pilot, and the whole world changed. The U-2 remains in service today, more than 65 years after Gary Powers was shot down. The aircraft has been continuously upgraded. Modern U-2s carry sensors and cameras far more capable than anything Powers could have imagined. They fly at even higher altitudes. They remain among the most valuable reconnaissance platforms in the American arsenal. But no U-2 has flown over hostile territory since 1960. The lesson of Gary Powers was learned. Satellites and drones now perform the missions that once required pilots to risk their lives over enemy airspace. The Glienicke Bridge, where Powers was exchanged for Abel, became known as the Bridge of Spies. It was used for several other prisoner exchanges during the Cold War. Today, it is a tourist attraction, a reminder of the divided world that once existed. Powers' legacy has been reassessed over the decades. Once viewed with suspicion, he is now generally recognized as a pilot who did his best in an impossible situation. He did not betray secrets beyond what the Soviets already possessed. He endured captivity with dignity. He served his country at great personal cost. The U-2 incident also serves as a warning about the dangers of overconfidence. The CIA believed its aircraft was invulnerable. It was not. They believed their cover story would hold. It did not. They believed they could control the consequences of exposure. They could not. In intelligence work, as in war, overconfidence is often more dangerous than the enemy. The Soviets did not need to be cleverer than the CIA. They just needed the CIA to believe it was cleverer than it actually was. That lesson, paid for with Gary Power's freedom and Eisenhower's reputation, remains relevant today.